Welcome to Pharmacoepidemiology, PHA 514. This is the first lecture. We will be covering Chapter 1, which is an introduction to pharmacoepidemiology using our reference book. The outline of the chapter is the following. Number 1 is definition of pharmacoepidemiology. Number 2 is a review of the drug approval process in the US. Number 3 is post-marketing surveillance. Number 4 is growth of pharmacoepidemiology. And then we move into research of pharmacoepidemiology. And finally, we finish with the role of pharmacists in pharmacoepidemiology. In this course, you will notice that the author is trying to introduce concepts that will be covered in different chapters of the book. Also, you will notice that in my lecture notes, I'm using a style of questions and answer. So feel free to read the question and try to find the answer on your own in the chapter if you want to read the chapter, or you can find the answers written in red. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to give a definition of pharmacoepidemiology. And basically, pharmacoepidemiology is two words put together, pharmacology and epidemiology. And the focus is going to be on epidemiology as a definition more than on pharmacology. Hopefully, you have a good understanding of pharmacology. Now, pharmacoepidemiology studies two things, the use and effect of drugs, and it does that in large population. And epidemiology in general is interested at looking at two things related to disease, which is the occurrence and the distribution of the diseases in a large population or in a population. So when we say occurrence is occurrence in space and in time, and the distribution is more related to the concepts of risk factors, predictors of these occurrences. So for example, why a certain person is at higher risk of a certain disease than other people. While pharmacoepidemiology, or epidemiology, I mean, is more related to diseases, its utilization in pharmacology, and therefore pharmacoepidemiology is going to be tied more to things related to drugs. But before we go into that, it's useful to understand or to know that epidemiology has two major arms. One that looks at chronic disease and one that looks at infectious disease. And therefore, you will hear about chronic disease epidemiology, infectious disease epidemiology. And what matters here is that the fact these two arms have developed their own mechanism of doing or investigating these diseases. And these investigative tools are a bit different because in infectious diseases, you have a single agent that in theory should be able to detect, isolate, and study, and maybe reinfect to make sure that this is the causing agent. Whereas in chronic diseases, when you're studying things like heart disease and diabetes, rarely there is a single cause. Rather, it's a multitude of causing or causation. And therefore, we need to understand what is cause. And we'll talk about that later. However, what we want to address here is that pharmacoepidemiology deals more with the tools developed for chronic disease epidemiology rather than infectious disease epidemiology. An important article that you will have on Blackboard is called Where is Epidemiology in Pharmacovigilance? In that article, the author talks about not two arms of epidemiology, rather two types of studies, and these are not to be confused. The two types of studies that are addressed in this in the article are the descriptive type of studies and the analytical type of studies. So pharmacoepidemiology looks at two aspects of drug use. These are the pattern of drug use and adverse drug effect. شو معناتها pattern of drug use? Pattern of drug use are listed here. So drug prescription patterns, the appropriateness of use, the medication adherence and persistence, identification of predictors of medication use. Once we're talking about who's using the drug, who prescribing the drug, how are they using the drug? Are they using it appropriately? All of that is use pattern. Whereas once you start looking at safety and adverse events, then you are into the adverse drug effects. Both of them under pharmacoepidemiology. The author points out that he's going to address adverse drug reactions in Chapter 9. However, he gives a short introduction or a definition of adverse event, adverse drug reaction, side effects, and medication error. Adverse event is troublesome medical occurrence while patient is taking the drug, but not necessarily caused by the drug. Whereas when it's directly linked to the drug, it becomes an adverse drug reaction. So adverse harmful or unpleasant outcome while patient is taking the drug and has a causal link with the drug. It may be dose dependent, it may be predictable, or it might be independent of those and unpredictable, which takes us to side effects. Side effects, this is when the ADR is dose dependent and predictable, regardless if it's desirable or not. And finally, medication error is preventable event that may lead to inappropriate use or patient harm. Also, there is an introduction of the drug life cycle. This is, you should be very familiar with the life cycle, starting from preclinical to phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and ending in post-marketing. And the reason the author introduces this life cycle is to point out that pharmacoepidemiology is related to all the aspects um, of the life cycle. So مش بس the post-marketing, which might come to your mind when you first see the cycle. You think pharmacoepidemiology is just right here. No, it's all of it. Because every time you're doing any kind of studies that are related to medication or drugs, that is considered pharmacoepidemiology. So that concludes part 1. In part 2, we're going to talk about the US drug approval process. So FDA is responsible for reviewing drugs, and more specifically, there is the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research inside FDA, which is responsible for making sure that the drug is safe and efficacious. So في فرق between what a drug is efficacious and effective. These two terms are different. وحنرجع the difference between these two terms in a minute. So the difference between efficacy and effectiveness. So the FDA writes regulations that are compiled in the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations to influence the new drug approval process. So it's the responsibility of the FDA. Also, there is an important act called the PDUFA Act, and Prescription Drug User Fee, which allows ADA to collect fee for reviewing drug applications. So قبل ما نبلش بphase 1, phase 2, phase 3 في the preclinical phase. And what does it consist of? In short, the drug company's responsibility in the preclinical phase is to show that their drug is reasonably safe. How did they do that? Presenting in vitro and animal studies. Okay, and then the drug company therefore submits something called the IND application, yani the investigational new drug application, to the FDA so that they can start the phase 1, and the FDA has 30 days to come back with an answer. That takes us to the characteristics of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and what happens at the end of phase 3. We're going to discuss these concepts quickly because you are familiar with them already. So phase 1 is made of volunteers. The sample size is not large. It's looking basically at safety. The duration is in months, and the design is randomized. In phase 2, that's where you start looking at people that are suffering from the condition. The sample size becomes larger. You're looking at safety, but also you're looking at the efficacy of the drug, and the duration is longer, but also the design is randomized and experimental. You have two arms. If we finish up with phase 3, which is Kamen suffering from the condition, this is the participants. The sample now can reach thousands, and it's focused on safety and efficacy. The study is longer in duration, it reaches years, and this is where the design becomes more controlled. So not only it's randomized, but you also have the double blind and the placebo. At the end of phase 3, the company, the pharmaceutical company, submits something called the new drug application, the NDA, where they will include the results from their animal studies, the clinical trial, also relevant information from marketing data, foreign studies, package insert, and manufacturing process. All of that will be submitted to the FDA. The FDA may approve, they may request minor revisions or not approve. The entire process takes years and costs a lot of dollars. Now, clinical studies, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, are not without limitations. These are the 4 limitations cited by the author. There are groups of patients or people that are not studied, in children مثلا, age-bearing women. Rare safety issues that need larger population or large numbers to be recruited may not be detected. You may not see the off-label use of this medication, and the duration of the study might be too short. We finish up with the difference between efficacy and effectiveness. Efficacy is, can the drug produce specific therapeutic outcome in controlled environment and in clinical trials? Whereas effectiveness, can it produce the desirable therapeutic outcome in practice, in the real world? And therefore, before we can have effectiveness, you must have efficacy. That takes us to the number 3, the third section of this chapter, which is post-marketing surveillance. Now, why we need post-marketing surveillance? The need for post-marketing surveillance comes from the fact that after the drug is released, millions of people are going to start using the drug, and therefore, things that you may not have seen before start occurring. For instance, patients with multiple disease start taking the drug, and you may have something called disease interaction. Patients taking multiple drugs start using the drug, and then you will have a drug interaction. Also, very rare events that you have not seen before starts occurring. What is post-marketing surveillance according to FDA? It's the process by which drug safety is monitored to identify potential problems with the use of the drugs after it has received FDA approval. So what is phase 4, and is post-marketing designs all phase 4? When you talk about phase 4, it is a post-marketing, but it is a randomized trial after the drug has received FDA approval, and it's designed to collect information about the safety of the drug and also how is it being used in other indication. Now, who requests the post-marketing studies? FDA can request it, but also pharmaceutical company can run their own post-marketing research. What are the design used for post-marketing? We did mention phase 4 clinical trials as one design, but there are other designs for post-marketing that may not be intervention in by nature, such as the case control design and the cohort design. Now, the fees that we mentioned collected in the PDUFA can be used to increase the surveillance of post-marketing, for example, after 2 years. One of the things that is very relevant to post-marketing surveillance in adverse event reporting. Remember, one of the major reasons we do post-marketing is looking at safety, and when you're talking about safety, you're talking about adverse event. So FDA has its own reporting system, which is the MedWatch, widely used for reporting adverse events. But also there is something called the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, which is developed by FDA and by CDC. However, there are other systems that are created by pharmaceutical company or healthcare organizations or governmental agencies. يمكن عندنا بلبنان the Ministry of Health have their own reporting agency, a reporting system. WHO has its own reporting system. حتى الacademician, they may have a reporting system where they write something called a case report and they submit it for publications. So these activities, meaning that reporting on adverse drug event, results in information that are not generalizable. So let me restart. These activities may not result. So when we're saying activities, we're meaning the adverse event reporting may not result in generalizable information, and are not always based on accurate information, but they can identify unexpected adverse event for further study. These mechanisms assist with pharmacovigilance, and the definition of pharmacovigilance, these are activities related to identification, assessment, and preventions of adverse drug event. So identification 1, assessment 2, and prevention of adverse drug event is what pharmacovigilance is all about. Adverse events report may quantify or may create something called a safety signal. And a safety signal is a potential link between the drug and the adverse event. So it's like a red flag, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there is an association. There could be an association that someone needs to study, to investigate. So what can FDA do after a safety signal was investigated? So مش بس after a safety signal was created. So safety signal, FDA investigated, and after they investigated, they can do a number of things. They can issue a label change, a Dear Doctor letter. They can publish articles, or they can withdraw. Hatta they can do a black box warning. Some withdrawals are actually voluntary, done by the pharmaceutical companies. And of note, 10% of drugs receive a black box warning. Spontaneous event reporting have four major limitations. These are Murphy control group, so you do not know what would happen in those not taking the drug. Difficulty assessing the frequency at which the adverse event is occurring. So you just know that there are adverse events, that they are occurring, but you don't know the frequency. You don't know what the prevalence rate of this, what percent of people taking the drug will end up there with the adverse event. You cannot know that just by looking at the spontaneous event reporting. Causation is difficult to establish. And also there could be some bias due to the reporter or the inaccurate or incomplete information reported. And that takes us to case study number 1. In case study number 1, the author addresses the safety signal that linked ALS to statin. So there was adverse event reporting, spontaneous reporting about ALS in patient taking statin. This safety signal was received by the FDA, and therefore the FDA issued a review of 41 controlled clinical trials. In these 41 controlled clinical trials, there were 64,000 people on statin and 56,000 on something else than statin. And after the review, they found out that out of the 64 on statin, 64,000, actually only 9 patients had ALS, and therefore we call this the incidence in the exposed. Whereas in the 56,000 not on statin, 10 individuals developed ALS, and therefore we call those the incidence in the not exposed. And when you compare these two incidence rate, it becomes very obvious that there's no reason to believe that there was actually a safety issue. Section number 4 of this chapter is the growth of pharmacoepidemiology. And the author starts with explaining the need for pharmacoepidemiology due to the increase in cost of medication, in polypharmacy, in chronic diseases, and in new drug development. He also points out that there are parties that have vested interest in looking at studies of medication, yani pharmacoepidemiology. These are the payers, the policymakers, the pharmaceutical company, governmental agency, clinicians, and patients. And he points out that pharmacoepidemiology is used as a mean to provide answers without having to invest in large and expensive clinical trials that may not always be feasible. So basically, pharmacoepidemiology is a tool to answer a question that you may not be able to do through a clinical trial, or that it will cost you a lot of money. One of the things that pharmacoepidemiology does is that they tap into something called secondary databases. And because صار في more and more secondary databases, pharmacoepidemiology is growing as a field. Now, ليه عم يصير في عنا secondary databases? Due to what? Advanced in informatics. Every time في administrative or transactional thing happening, data is being stored somewhere. And at a certain point, you may extract that data and use it for investigational purposes for pharmacoepidemiology. So secondary databases are, for example, administrative or transactional. They could be electronic medical records. They could be coming from adverse events reporting system, outpatient registry, or national surveys. And also the FDA Amendment Act of 2007 started the Sentinel Initiative for post-marketing surveillance that links all data from multiple sources, yani Medicare, Veteran Administration, or private sectors. Okay. Now, the concept of secondary databases will be discussed in chapter 4, but in short, this is when you have a database that is collected for a certain purpose and then you use it to answer a pharmacoepidemiology study. And that takes us to section 5, which is pharmacoepidemiological research. Pharmacoepidemiology can address practice-relevant questions whereby the results can influence practice and policies. An example is provided. So here's an example where the drug in question was olanzapine, the second-generation antipsychotic, and the outcome or the adverse event was hyperglycemia. where this link, there was a link, there was a signal, and therefore they investigated the relationship. Where did they investigated this relationship? They went to a secondary database, and data that already had data on both. That came from the UK General Practice Research Database, which they reviewed data from 1987 to 2000. So they reviewed 13 years worth of data. The design that they used is what is called the match case control design, where the cases were 451 diabetic patients or diabetic outcome, and they matched them to 2,696 controls. And after they looked at the relationship between the hyperglycemia and olanzapine, the results were significant increase in diabetes among users of olanzapine when they were compared to non-users or users of conventional antipsychotic. Falakin, they found out that there is a link between the two, and therefore there was a recommendation for clinicians to consider the risk-benefit ratio of olanzapine for each patient before prescribing. Also, there is an important thing where we need to understand the difference between association and causation. In this part of this chapter, the author tries to make a case for the coming chapter. This chapter 1 kind of like introduces or hint into the chapters coming up in this course. The author starts by pointing out that there's a difference between causation and association, and this is true. We'll talk about that in future lectures. And therefore, there's a need to look at the design of the study and the statistical tools used in the study to be able to differentiate between an artifactual association, a true association, and once we're starting about a true association, what's the difference between just an association and causation? Chapter 6 will address the guidelines for determining causality, and we will do that. We'll talk about that. Whereas designs that are good to look at causations, henny experimental designs, however, they are costly and they're not always feasible due to the ethical or practical reasons. Therefore, pharmacoepidemiology rely on non-experimental design. هنحكي مين non-experimental design. And therefore, chapter 3 reviews study design. Chapter 3 is short. In this course, we will go beyond chapter 3. We will discuss cohort designs and case control designs in much more details. That takes us to chapter 5 and chapter 6. Chapter 5 talks about statistical technique, which we'll not cover here. But I will have a section that will review testing hypothesis for those that need to look at that. And chapter 6 looks about the rigor of designs, yani what can be done to protect research designs from biases and confounding. There are 4 types of research questions that could be raised and addressed by pharmacoepidemiology, and these are the patterns of drug use, safety issues, okay, effectiveness issues, and economical evaluation, and consequence of therapy as regard to economically wise. So people are affording the drug. Is it worth paying for this amount of money? Should the government cover it? Should drug company covers for it, etc. Meaningful users of pharmacoepidemiological research. There's a number of users: governmental agencies for one, pharmaceutical industries, practitioners, academicians, people in the legal system, patients and consumers advocate, and international users. So that takes us to the second case study. And the second case study, the author is trying to illustrating the use of pharmacoepidemiology by multiple stakeholders. The thing about this is probably we should start here. CBS reported that a 57-year-old person on Viagra went blind in his right eye, and that person sued Pfizer. So this is the media aspect of it and the legal aspect of it. So what's the question at hand? What is the problem at hand? Well, phosphodiesterase type 5, yani PDE5, such as Viagra, Levitra, Cialis, are used to treat ED, have been associated link or safety signal with something called sudden vision loss, or neon. In 2005, 43 cases of neons were reported to FDA. Okay, مثل ما قلنا every time there is a safety signal معناتها FDA will take action, they will investigate, but not automatically it means there is a problem. So they investigated, and so for example, when they investigated, the example of number of users is just huge. So Viagra alone was used by 23 million people. So you can imagine the large number of users. So when it's such a large number of users and بس 43 cases of something like that, what does it mean? Well, after investigation, FDA requested a package insert to be updated. طب who is interested in a study like this? Who would be interested in this finding? Well, حكينا على الميديا وحكينا على legal system, بس كمان academicians would be interested, clinicians would be interested, pharmaceutical company would be interested, and FDA would be interested. So, as you can see, a lot of interest in pharmacoepidemiological study. Tab number 6, the last section is the role of pharmacists and public health practitioners in pharmacoepidemiology. The authors start by saying that because pharmacists are the drug experts, they are equipped with the necessary skills to make them play a prime role in pharmacoepidemiology. Remember, the majority of ADR are reported by 2 health professionals, doctors, and pharmacists. And therefore, public health professionals, including pharmacists, can help in further developing the reporting system and databases. Pharmacists can use the pharmacoepidemiological findings to apply at their individual and population level. So at the individual level, with their dispensing, when suggesting a replacement, they could use the results from pharmacoepidemiology study. At population level, while serving on therapeutic committees or patient safety committees, they will be able to use knowledge of their pharmacoepidemiological training. Also, pharmacists often conduct drug use evaluations, and therefore, while doing that, they will use the principle of pharmacoepidemiology to do these projects. Now, pharmaceutical company, government agency, healthcare plans have interest in conducting pharmacoepidemiology studies. And when they want to do pharmacoepidemiological studies, they will look for healthcare professionals to help them. And one of these healthcare professionals that can be a great asset to add it to the pharmacoepidemiology research team would be a pharmacist with a specific training in pharmacoepidemiology, because they will not only bring their clinical knowledge, but they will also bring in their training in pharmacoepidemiology. There's a growing pharmacoepidemiology is a growing discipline, and that what can attest to that is the large number of articles that have been published in journals like the JAMA and the New England Journal of Medicine. Also, the International Society of Pharmacoepidemiology that has been created, dedicated for the advancement of pharmacoepidemiology, including pharmacovigilance, drug utilization research, comparative effectiveness of drugs, and therapeutic risk assessment. Also, the pharmacoepidemiology has been introduced in curricula of health-related schools. مثلا pharmacy schools, public health schools, or medical schools are now including pharmacoepidemiology in their curricula. In fact, ACPE, our accreditation body, requires the pharmacy students to receive some sort of training in pharmacoepidemiology. And we're going to finish with this example, كمان showing how pharmacists can be involved in pharmacoepidemiological research. So what is the research question? Determine the frequency, the severity, and the preventability of ADRs leading to hospitalization in medical intensive care unit. The study design was a prospective study design. The findings were that in 281 admissions to MICU over 19 weeks, they found out that 21 of the 281, yani 7.5, were ADRs related. So that's the frequency question. And 18 out of the 27 were deemed preventable. And therefore, the recommendations for doctors, pharmacists, and nurses to get educated or to receive education about polypharmacy and continuous surveillance to prevent DD interaction, and the intervention and policy need to be considered. We finish up with the chapter objectives. By reading the chapter objectives, you will see if we have covered everything about this chapter. Thank you for your time.